Cross of Iron is easily one of Sam Peckinpah's most overlooked war films, a brutal and unflinching anti-war masterpiece that depicted the Eastern Front from the German perspective and became one of the most controversial World War II films ever made. So, let's take a look behind the scenes of the movie with 12 things you didn't know about Cross of Iron, including how the film's chaotic production mirrored the on-screen carnage, the casting controversy that nearly derailed the entire project, and Peckinpah's descent into addiction that turned the set into a war zone of its own. Now, the screenplay was penned by Julius J. Epstein, one of Hollywood's most celebrated writers who had won an Academy Award for co-writing Casablanca in 1942. Epstein was commissioned by producer Wolf Hartwig to adapt Willy Heinrich's 1956 novel The Willing Flesh, a gritty, disillusioned account of German soldiers fighting a losing battle on the Russian front in 1943. The original working title stuck close to the source material, but the studio eventually settled on Cross of Iron, a reference to the Iron Cross medal that becomes a symbol of empty military honor in the film. Epstein's challenge was enormous. He had to humanize German soldiers without glorifying Nazism, depict the horrors of the Eastern Front without exploitation, and create a narrative that worked as both visceral war cinema and philosophical meditation on the futility of combat. Epstein spent months researching German military culture, the conditions on the Eastern Front where millions died in some of the war's most brutal fighting, and the psychological profiles of soldiers caught between duty and survival. His script emphasized the class tensions within the Wehrmacht, contrasting working-class soldiers who fought for survival with aristocratic officers who craved medals and glory. This social critique would become one of the film's most powerful elements, showing how military hierarchies perpetuated inequality even in the midst of catastrophic defeat. So, director Sam Peckinpah was brought on to helm the production at a particularly turbulent point in his career. Peckinpah, coming off the commercial disappointment of The Killer Elite in 1975 and struggling with alcoholism and cocaine addiction, was considered unreliable and difficult by Hollywood standards. His reputation for on-set violence, budget overruns, and confrontations with producers had made him virtually unemployable in the American film industry. Studio executives viewed him as toxic, a once brilliant filmmaker whose self-destructive tendencies had finally caught up with his talent. Cross of Iron represented a lifeline, a chance to work in Europe with a substantial budget and relative creative freedom away from Hollywood scrutiny. Peckinpah was drawn to the material because it aligned with his obsessions: masculine codes of honor, the corruption of institutions, violence as both tragedy and spectacle, and men struggling to maintain dignity in systems designed to destroy them. He saw the film as an opportunity to create the ultimate anti-war statement, a movie so brutal and uncompromising that it would make audiences physically recoil from combat rather than celebrate it. Peckinpah had never directed a World War II film before, but his westerns had always been about men caught between dying codes and encroaching modernity themes that translated perfectly to the German army's collapse on the Eastern Front. He viewed the Wehrmacht's retreat through the same lens he'd viewed the fading of the Old West, as tragedy, as inevitability, as the grinding of individual lives beneath historical forces beyond their control. Now, casting the lead role of Sergeant Rolf Steiner, the cynical, battle-hardened squad leader who represents working-class professionalism in contrast to aristocratic careerism, required an actor who could convey both physical toughness and weary intelligence. James Coburn, a frequent Peckinpah collaborator who had starred in Pat Garrett and Billy the Kid and shared the director's fascination with masculinity and violence, was Peckinpah's top choice. Coburn had the weathered face, the lean physicality, and the sardonic delivery that Peckinpah needed for Steiner. He could project authority without theatricality, could make violence seem both necessary and exhausting, could suggest depths of experience without explaining them. Coburn was also willing to work for scale in Europe during a period when his Hollywood career had cooled, making him available for the extended shoot. For Coburn, Steiner represented a chance to play a genuinely complex character, not a hero or villain, but a survivor navigating impossible circumstances with a personal code that superseded official ideology. Coburn threw himself into research, studying German military culture, learning weapon handling, and working to capture the physical exhaustion of soldiers who had been fighting for years without respite. He understood that Steiner was Peckinpah's ultimate embodiment of masculine competence corroded by institutional betrayal, a professional soldier whose skills keep him alive, but whose intelligence makes him see through the lies that send men to die for nothing. However, the casting of Maximilian Schell as Captain Stransky, the aristocratic Prussian officer desperate to earn an Iron Cross to prove his courage and salvage his family's military reputation, became one of the film's most controversial decisions. Schell was an Austrian actor who had won an Academy Award for playing a German defense attorney in Judgment at Nuremberg, and he brought gravitas, intelligence, and old-world sophistication to every role. But Schell and Peckinpah clashed almost immediately over interpretation and approach. Schell wanted to play Stransky with more nuance and psychological complexity, showing the character's insecurity and fear beneath his aristocratic arrogance, making him a tragic figure destroyed by class expectations. Peckinpah wanted Stransky as an almost operatic villain, a symbol of class privilege and military corruption, someone the audience could hate without reservation. The two men argued constantly, with Schell accusing Peckinpah of reducing the character to a caricature, and Peckinpah accusing Schell of intellectualizing a role that needed to be visceral and immediate. Their on-set confrontations became legendary, with shouting matches and threats to quit on both sides. Despite these tensions, or perhaps because of them, Schell's performance is mesmerizing. He makes Stransky both pathetic and dangerous, a coward who sends men to die to burnish his own reputation, a man so consumed by the need to prove himself that he becomes monstrous. The Steiner-Stransky conflict becomes the film's moral center, representing the collision between authentic courage earned through survival and performative honor purchased with other men's lives. So, principal photography began in early 1976 in Yugoslavia, where the production could access Soviet-era military equipment, trained military extras, and locations that could convincingly double for the Russian front. The Yugoslav People's Army provided T-34 tanks, artillery pieces, uniforms, and hundreds of soldiers as extras, giving the film an authenticity that would have been impossible to achieve in Western Europe or Hollywood. The Yugoslav military's cooperation was crucial. They understood armored warfare, tactical movements, and the visual language of Eastern Front combat in ways that Western militaries didn't. However, filming in Yugoslavia presented enormous challenges. The locations were remote, often requiring hours of travel over primitive roads. The infrastructure was basic at best, and coordination with the Yugoslav military required navigating bureaucratic complexities and language barriers. Peckinpah's deteriorating health and increasing substance abuse exacerbated these difficulties exponentially. He was drinking heavily throughout production, often arriving on set intoxicated or incapacitated, and his cocaine use accelerated as the shoot progressed and pressures mounted. The cast and crew watched Peckinpah spiral in real time, witnessing a brilliant filmmaker destroying himself while trying to create his masterpiece. James Coburn later described the production as one of the most difficult of his career, with Peckinpah oscillating between moments of absolute genius where he'd conceive and execute sequences of breathtaking power and periods of complete dysfunction where he was unable to work at all. The crew learned to shoot when Peckinpah was lucid and wait out his episodes, a strategy that stretched the schedule and inflated costs, but kept the production moving forward. Now, Peckinpah's signature visual style, the use of slow motion, rapid cutting, and multiple camera angles to choreograph violence, reached its apotheosis in Cross of Iron. Peckinpah wanted combat sequences that were both beautiful and horrifying, that captured the chaos and confusion of battle while forcing audiences to confront the physical reality of violence rather than consume it as sanitized entertainment. Cinematographer John Coquillon, who had shot several Peckinpah films including Straw Dogs and Pat Garrett and Billy the Kid, used multiple cameras running at different speeds to capture action from various perspectives simultaneously. The battle sequences were meticulously planned despite Peckinpah's condition, with the director storyboarding every shot in his lucid moments and choreographing explosions, gunfire, and troop movements like elaborate dance sequences. The slow-motion interlude soldiers caught in explosions, bodies falling through the air, faces contorted in agony, blood spraying in graceful arcs transformed combat into a kind of violent ballet. Critics would debate whether this aestheticization of violence contradicted the film's anti-war message, whether making carnage beautiful somehow glorified what it claimed to condemn. Peckinpah argued that beauty and horror were inseparable, that showing violence in all its terrible splendor was the only way to make audiences truly understand its cost, rather than allowing them the comfort of looking away. He wanted viewers to feel complicit, to be seduced by the imagery, and then forced to confront what they'd been seduced by. However, one of the film's most devastating sequences involves a young Russian boy that Steiner's squad captures. Rather than turn him over to command for execution, Steiner protects him, and for a brief moment, the boy becomes a surrogate son and a symbol of lost innocence. The scenes are remarkably tender, suggesting that Steiner's humanity survives despite the carnage. But here is where Peckinpah twists the knife. Steiner eventually releases the boy, urging him to run back to the Russian lines to save his life. The boy runs through the mist, happy to be free, but due to a change in passwords or simple confusion, the Russian sentries mistake him for a German attacker. In a cruel twist of irony, The boy is gunned down by his own comrades' friendly fire. Steiner witnesses this from a distance, helpless. It is a moment of pure nihilism. It wasn't the enemy or the villain Stransky who killed innocents. It was the chaos of war itself. This moment shatters Steiner, hardening his cynicism into something darker, proving that in this war, good deeds don't just go unpunished, they are rendered totally meaningless. So, while critics often debate whether the film tries to present a clean Wehrmacht, there is one scene that violently confronts the reality of German war crimes. In the film, Steiner's platoon captures a unit of female Russian soldiers. While Steiner treats them with professional distance, one of Stransky's sycophants, a soldier named Dietz, attempts to assault and rape one of the women. This leads to a brutal confrontation where Steiner catches Dietz in the act. But rather than simply arresting him, Steiner exacts a form of poetic, brutal justice. He leaves Dietz alone in the room with the female soldiers, locking the door as he leaves. We then hear the sounds of the women exacting their revenge on their tormentor, stabbing him to death. It is a shocking scene that directly addresses the sexual violence and atrocities of the Eastern Front. It shows that while Steiner might be honorable, the army he serves is rotting from the inside out, filled with men like Dietz, who view conquest as a license for depravity. It is Peckinpah's way of showing that there is no such thing as a clean war, and even the heroes are forced to facilitate brutality to maintain their own code of ethics. Now, the production descended into chaos as filming progressed through the spring and summer of 1976. Peckinpah's substance abuse intensified week by week, his behavior became increasingly erratic and unpredictable, and his confrontations with producers and cast members grew more frequent and more violent. He fired crew members impulsively over minor infractions or imagined slights, screamed at actors during takes, and sometimes disappeared for hours or days, leaving the production in limbo. The budget spiraled out of control as Peckinpah insisted on reshooting sequences that he deemed inadequate, adding more explosions and pyrotechnics, and extending the schedule far beyond what had been planned. Producer Wolf Hartwig watched his $4 million budget balloon to nearly $6 million, and tensions between Hartwig and Peckinpah reached a breaking point where violence seemed inevitable. At one point, Hartwig threatened to shut down production entirely and salvage what footage existed, and only intervention from James Coburn and other cast members who believed in the film kept it alive. Coburn essentially became a mediator between Peckinpah and the producers, protecting his friend while trying to salvage the production, sometimes directing sequences himself when Peckinpah was incapacitated. The Yugoslav military grew frustrated with delays and the production's inability to stick to agreed schedules, and they demanded additional payments to continue providing equipment and personnel, further straining the budget. Remarkably, despite all this chaos, the addiction, the fights, the budget overruns, the near shutdowns, the film that emerged was coherent, powerful, and devastating, a testament to Peckinpah's genius, even in the midst of self-destruction. However, when Cross of Iron premiered in January 1977, critical reception was deeply divided along national and ideological lines. Vincent Canby of the New York Times called it a series of stunningly photographed, ear-splitting military encounters that are as boring as they are ugly, arguing that Peckinpah's visual pyrotechnics overwhelmed any coherent anti-war message and reduced the film to sensory assault. Roger Ebert was more sympathetic, praising the film's uncompromising brutality and Coburn's performance as one of the actor's finest, but questioning whether the film's aestheticization of violence undermined its supposed moral critique. European critics were generally more receptive than American ones, particularly in Germany, where the film sparked intense debates about representing the Wehrmacht and confronting wartime history. The film's limited American release and poor box office performance, it grossed less than $600,000 domestically, seemed to confirm Hollywood's worst fears about Peckinpah's unmarketability and sealed his exile from the American film industry. The film found a stronger reception in Europe, particularly in France and Germany, where it was recognized as a serious artistic engagement with war rather than merely exploitation or propaganda, and where Peckinpah's auteur status protected it from dismissal. But nowadays, Cross of Iron is widely viewed as one of Peckinpah's finest achievements and one of the greatest anti-war films ever made, a brutal masterpiece that influenced generations of filmmakers and redefined how cinema could depict combat. Its depiction of combat sensory overload and psychological trauma anticipated films like Saving Private Ryan and The Hurt Locker by decades. Directors like Quentin Tarantino have cited it as a massive influence, with Tarantino famously stating he wanted Inglourious Basterds to match the coolness and intensity of Peckinpah's work. The film's unflinching portrayal of the Eastern Front's brutality, its critique of military hierarchy and manufactured heroism, and its suggestion that courage and survival exist independent of ideology have given it enduring relevance. Film scholars have reevaluated Peckinpah's visual strategies, arguing that the slow-motion violence isn't glorification, but rather a technique to make audiences confront what they'd otherwise look away from, to force them to experience the duration and impact of violence rather than consume it as entertainment. The film's final freeze frame, Steiner laughing maniacally as Stransky struggles to reload his gun in the middle of battle, accompanied by the sound of children's laughter from the opening credits, remains one of cinema's most haunting endings, suggesting that war reduces everything to absurdity and madness, that the only sane response to the insanity of combat is laughter that acknowledges the cosmic joke. Cross of Iron stands as Peckinpah's most complete realization of his artistic vision, a film where his obsessions with violence, honor, betrayal, and masculine codes found their perfect expression in the crucible of history's most destructive conflict. But let me know below, do you think Cross of Iron is Peckinpah's masterpiece and the definitive anti-war film, or does its aestheticization of violence undermine its moral message? Is the film's sympathetic portrayal of Wehrmacht soldiers problematic historical revisionism, or a necessary acknowledgement of soldiers' common humanity across all armies?